Thanks very much indeed. It's always lovely to be here. Thanks so many of you for turning out. I do have a very slight cold. It's not even man flu. It's very, very slight. But if I do start spluttering or something, do not panic. It's just having a little moment. So the book's been out for a little while now, and I've done various talks about it. But you're a philosophy audience, so I wanted to say a bit more about the philosophy, because the philosophy in the book isn't highly evident. I mean, the philosophy of the title is, of course, philosophy in kind of the other sense of the word, a philosophy. It's trying to, the conclusion of the book, what the book is trying to work towards, is a kind of an ethos, or a way of doing things, a set of principles that we can use to help us design food system fit for the centuries to come, decades to come. In terms of the kind of philosophy, or as of the discipline, now, there's a kind of way of doing applied philosophy which I'm not very, very keen on. This is where you kind of you take some kind of philosophical theory and you apply it. So, you say, what would a utilitarian say about, I don't know, the global food economy, or, what are the Kantian deontological duties we have, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I don't think that's a very helpful way of doing practical philosophy, because, of course, in the real world, most people do not agree on any particular philosophical theory or principle. So to base your kind of arguments on one specific school of philosophy, one approach, isn't going to help us to sort of build any kind of consensus or general understanding. But I think there are other ways in which you can bring philosophy to bear on issues of the day. And when you do that, it's kind of often the philosophy itself ends up being almost under the surface. So I think one of the best examples I could think of this in recent decades was Honora O'Neill. I'm sure you all know Honora O'Neill, Baroness O'Neill. She gave the BBC Reith lectures about 20 odd years ago now on trust in public life. They're very, very good. Of course, you can still listen to them on the BBC website, and a little book came out of it. It's really interesting. The same year as that, she published a little monograph with Cambridge on Kant. And the two books are totally different, in the sense that, the book on Kant, obviously, it's explicitly talking about all the philosophical arguments. In the book on trust, the philosophy is kind of under the surface. If you're kind of sensitive to the kind of issues she's talking about, you will notice it. But it's not often made absolutely explicit. And I think often the kind of philosophy we bring to public life is a bit more like that. We're bringing a philosophical way of thinking, philosophical tools to a discussion, but we're not kind of explicitly layering it with theories, views, and principles. And so thinking about how I'd do this evening, I thought I could do, in a sense, a bit of a mashup between this book and the previous book, How to Think Like a Philosopher. Because I think that what I could show is, in a way, how I sort of was thinking like a philosopher about food in this book. So you can see how the philosophy kind of feeds in a way that you might not if I just talked about the content of the book. And there's a very good reason I think philosophy can do this. Why do we do philosophy? What's the point of philosophy in the first place? As you know, sort of definitions of what philosophy is are very sort of hard to come by, quite contentious. Wilfrid Sellars, actually amazing this, I did philosophy for about 30 years before I came across Wilfrid Sellars' definition. He said the aim of philosophy is to understand how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. It's good, isn't it? I think it's really good. But the point is, I think it's true. It is about things in the broadest possible sense of the term. So if you take anything like, knowledge, well, if you're a chemist, you want knowledge of chemicals. If you're a geographer, you want knowledge of human populations, land, whatever it might be. As a philosopher, you want to understand what knowledge is in the most general sense of the word. Similarly, in ethics, what is good, what is right. So philosophy is this very, very generalized discipline. But it's actually quite interesting when you think about it in those terms, because the way philosophy has evolved culturally, it's become a highly specialized academic discipline. So you might think that philosophy is actually a very, very, not broad at all, it's very narrow. In fact, it is actually very, very broad. And what I wanted to do in my book was to sort of do this thing of hanging together for the food system. It's to understand how the food world, as I call it, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hangs together in the broadest possible sense of the term. So I think there's a kind of like, there's a similarity here. The kind of things philosophers do, which is look for the most general kind of features and the most general truths, etc., can be applied to sort of something like the food world. Because the thing about the food world, as I call it, it's incredibly complicated. The term food world, I toyed with the idea of having some kind of, neologism, the nutrisphere or something, whatever it might be. Because we don't really have a word which captures this sort of domain which food touches on. Everything from the growing and the harvesting, the distribution, the eating. Food touches so much. And there isn't really anyone who is an expert on the whole food world, right? No one can be such a thing. So in a way, this kind of book requires a generalist. So I'd say rather than it being some kind of weird anomaly that a philosopher has decided to write this book, I think if you want to understand the food system in the broadest sense of the term, you need a generalist. But that generalist then has to do certain things, which I think good philosophers do. Now, in my book, How to Think Like a Philosopher, one of the chapter titles was this: think for yourself and not by yourself, right? And what I mean there is that philosophy does encourage you to use your own mind, have independence of thought. I think rather unfortunately that image of philosophy has become perhaps somewhat exaggerated and caricatured. So imagine the best way to do philosophy is to sit in your own room very privately, deep in your own thoughts. It also encourages people, I think, to mistakenly think that if they're doing philosophy, the best thing they could do is to come up with their own theories. I think this is a very dangerous thing. I discourage you to come up with your own theories. I mean, if you do have a good one, sure, fine. But people have been doing this for over 2,000 years, and what you find, most of the best ideas are out there. And actually, what the most smart thing we can do is to sort of take the best from what is already been out there, maybe put it together in new ways, maybe apply it to new things. But we're very, very, very few of us are going to have genuinely new ideas. So, we think independently, but we think with all the great thinkers of the past. We think with other people, which is really why it's excellent you've got a group like this, right? Because where you can actually meet and discuss philosophy with other people. This is what philosophers have always done. In ancient Greece, if we're just talking about the Western tradition, in ancient Greece, we have, the academy, the lyceum. Of course, philosophers always did this. Descartes has this image of the solitary philosopher because the Meditations is written as somebody just sitting in his room. But as we know, he was part of this network, this sort of letters in which he exchanged letters with people. He sent drafts of the books to everybody. He had their replies. He was in constant dialogue. So we really, I think good philosophy is always about thinking with others. And that's what I tried to do in this book. And secondly, the other bit of advice which related to this, I said, was to be eclectic. Because actually, again, it's if you're going to think about anything which is other than the most purely theoretical, philosophical subject, it always touches upon other disciplines other than philosophy. You need that psychology, whatever it might be. So in this book, actually, at the end of this book, I have credits, I call them. It's usually get these acknowledgements in books, where people thank a few people, etc., etc. And for my last few books, I wanted to do something a little bit more sort of systematic than that, because actually I think we ought to recognize the fact that there's a lot of collaboration in this. So, I have like a list of credits, like in a movie, of all the people who helped with the book. But here also in this book, a list of the interviewees. In order to write this book, I had to speak to people who are experts in particular areas of the food world. And then my job was to try and put it all together. So I think, this approach of sorry, I can see someone needs to be admitted to the thing. I'll try to click that on the Zoom. The fact that we need to think with others, we need to be eclectic, and that's what I tried to do. Now, in this book, How to Think Like a Philosopher, at the end I wanted to conclude it. And I wanted, and it doesn't make a lot of sense as a conclusion because the pages and pages of the book. But I thought, in a way, that if you're going to think philosophically, you can break down the main things you do into a nice little acronym. I couldn't create a nice acronym, but I did realise the first letters were ACDC, which is quite ironic because if you want to think of a band whose lyrics are about as unphilosophical as you can get, it's AC/DC. Anyone a secret fan of AC/DC in the audience? Yes, thank you very much, of course, of course. So what are the AC/DC? Attend, clarify, deconstruct and connect. These, I think, are the four key things you do when you're thinking philosophically. The first one, I think, is really most important and is the underappreciated one. I think that all the best thinkers, what they're paying very, very close attention to whatever it is they're trying to explain or understand. They're very careful in that, right? So you might call it being empirical, but not necessarily. It's also attending to the words, to the structures. I think so much of what good philosophers do is they notice things other people haven't noticed. I won't go into examples. Think of examples of your own here, but that's often what's going on, not necessarily an argument. There's an element of clarification as well. I think when you're thinking philosophically, the cliched philosophical question is, well, what do you mean by ... Yeah? People who are not philosophical tend to get annoyed or irritated by that, but if people are philosophical, they know that that's absolutely important to do. And at the point of clarifying, what do we mean by these concepts, how do they really apply, etc., etc. Deconstructing, in broad terms, is the picking apart. Again, another thing which non-philosophers find irritating. But, trying to, where you might have, take knowledge, for example. Let's take a very, very sort of baby sort of philosophy 101 example. Where you have somebody talk about knowledge, it's deconstructing what that means and recognizing that there are different forms of knowledge. There's knowledge of that, there's know-how, and there's knowledge by acquaintance and by description, whatever it might be. So you're sort of like deconstructing things. You're also deconstructing arguments. But the final thing is also to connect, to make connections. Ultimately, you can do a form of philosophy which is entirely destructive, actually. People can make careers simply kind of tearing things down. Arguably, you might say that that's what, Plato's Socrates did in the end, actually offered very, very few positive hypotheses, but was leaving things in a mess, and that had a kind of certain constructive purpose. But ultimately, we also wanted to make connections. So I think that these kind of four things that philosophers do, I was trying to do for the food world. Now, I'm going to give examples mainly about attending and connecting here. The clarifying and deconstructing will come along the way, but I want to focus on those four things. Here we go. So the first thing about attending is follow the facts, right? Empiricism is a school of philosophy, but I think any decent philosopher will pay close attention to the facts. And in this sense, philosophy is not special. If you're going to think about the food world, you're thinking about our food system, your first duty is to think about the facts and get very clear about them. And a lot of the research for my book was of that kind. I had to really unearth the facts, which, isn't always easy because most facts about the food system are contested. But fortunately, there are some pretty authoritative bodies, pretty authoritative studies, and a lot of the key information is out there and true. So there may be some arguments, for example, about how productive organic agriculture is compared to conventional agriculture, and I'll perhaps come back to that later. But some of the big things are really evident. And one of the things about following the facts is that you see that whatever you might say about our food system, it is, pretty much everyone agree, in a fundamental sense, broken. Now, this is somewhat paradoxical, though, because on the one hand, you might say we've never had as much and as plentiful food as we do now. It's entirely true. So at the moment, the global food production produces about, I think, 3,000 calories for every human being on the planet, when the average calorific need is more like 2,500 to 2,500. So, we produce more than ever before. In countries like ours, food has never been cheaper. Now, some people almost get offended by saying that because the cost of living crisis, etc., etc. Although it's true that food prices have gone up in recent years, they've gone up from an incredibly low base. And as a proportion of income we spend on food, it's still extremely low by historical standards. So You might say, what's the idea then the food system is broken? It managed to survive the pandemic. It managed to survive Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So you might think there's nothing to see here. There are no problems. But the facts do suggest otherwise, and I'll give you several of them. And these figures are all from things like the UN World Health Organization. So they're pretty robust figures. By 2050, an estimated 90% of the world's soils will be degraded, right? So the form of farming we've been doing, which has been very, very productive in the short term, unfortunately is depleting the soils. They're simply taking out the nutrients in the soils are being reduced with every kind of harvest. There are some alarmist claims that we only have like 50 harvests left, or whatever it might be. These are exaggerated, you'll be pleased to know. But nevertheless, there's a deep truth underneath it, which is this, that the soils are getting depleted and depleted. They can't go on getting depleted. The food system is also the primary driver of biodiversity loss, right? So biodiversity in the world is largely driven by the food system. Why? Well, mainly because of land, wildernesses, wildlife, ecosystems being converted for crop production or grazing. And a lot of the crop production it's being converted towards is to grow feed in order to feed to pigs, cows, etc. It might be. And so and biodiversity loss is huge. Between 1970 and 2018, wildlife populations around the world declined by 69%. I have to say, some of these figures, I mean, I've got the references in the book, so do look them up. Every time I have to repeat them, I can barely believe them myself. It's still the case that around these figures would all be from the recent years. So they might be 2022, 23, something like that. Almost 600 million people will still be facing hunger in 2030, right? 600 million people. And in 2022, 9.2% of the world's population was undernourished, nearly 1 in 10. In terms of food security, meaning that people can't be sure where their next meal is coming from, in 2022, nearly 3 in every 10 people were moderately or severely food insecure. And actually more than 1 in 10 were severely food insecure. That means, not being able the confidence of being sure that where your next meals are coming from. At the same time, we've got this problem of undernourishment. We also have problems of overnourishment. Obesity worldwide has tripled since 1975. And by 2016, 30% were obese with 39% overweight. So our food system has these really quite somewhat bizarre features, which is that it's almost like a third, and a third. About a third of the world is well nourished, healthy, etc., etc. But a third is overweight, overnourished in that sense, and suffering health consequences of that, while a third is undernourished. And you also sometimes get a combination of over and undernourishment in the same people. Egypt, I think, is one of these countries which has both high rates of obesity and high rates of micronutrient deficiency, etc., etc. Reason being that people are being kept, they're getting plenty of calories through very basic staples like wheat and everything, but they're not getting enough of a wide variety of fruit, vegetables, meat, dairy, etc. And so they're lacking essential micronutrients. So, and there are more to come. It's a whole litany of horrible truths here. More people, so it's actually now true that more people live in countries where being overweight is a bigger killer than undernourishment, than live in countries where lack of food takes more lives. That's such a horrible sentence, but you see what I mean. So if more people are living in a country where the major health problem is being overweight than are living in countries where being undernourished is a problem, which is quite staggering in a way. 2.4 billion people don't have year-round access to nutritious, safe and sufficient food, and 42% of the population are unable to afford a healthy diet. So that's the other thing as well. We have plenty of food, etc., but there are lots of people, even in this country, struggle to be able to afford a healthy diet. They can feed their families, but are they getting the full range of nutrients? Then there's water usage. Water usage is becoming really problematic. Climate change is having effects. There are certain rivers that are drying up because there's less ice at high levels, feeding them, and so forth. And of course, agriculture is just the biggest user of water. So it's depleting water quite dramatically. Places in southern Spain are suffering from this. So if you go to your typical supermarket at this time of the year, a lot of your fruit and veg is going to come from Spain and also from Morocco. If you've been to southern Spain recently and flown over it, you can see these huge, huge fields of polytunnels. They're remarkably efficient in lots of ways, but they're working by drawing water from the aquifers and they're drying them out. There's parts down there where they're in danger of running out of water. So water stress is a huge problem. And also the food system is, of course, responsible for a third of anthropogenic greenhouse gases. So when you follow the facts, you see that things are broken. Things have got to be fixed. And so this is what we've got to do. Oh, I haven't got more, have I? I do. Population, right? Okay, so population is interesting because a lot of people think the problem with food is population. It is and it isn't. As I've already said, we've got enough food to feed the whole world. Population is going to stabilize. So it's not population per se, but the rising population and the kind of food that population is eating is putting stress on the system. So the key thing is meat consumption rising. Meat consumption is set to rise by 14% in the 2020s. Population rising only 11%. As countries get richer, people want more meat, dairy, and so forth. And if it continues to grow at the current rate in the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, meat production will have to increase from the current rate of 300 million tons every year to 470 million tons by 2050. So you can see the huge strain on the land that is being put by this increased meat consumption, especially. If we could grow the population while reducing meat consumption, which would be entirely possible, there'd be a lot less environmental stress. And also, not just meat, but from the sea. Blue foods, as they call those from marine or fresh waters, predicted to double by 2050. And again, I can't really talk too much about that, but you'll be aware probably of the huge impacts of fishing. Fish farming has all sorts of problems. It's often very intensive, badly done, creates pollution for the waters, illness for the fish. But wild fishing is often disastrous as well, because the kind of methods they use, including the dredging of the seabed, they basically trawl the seabed, just drag everything into a net, and it's like if you like raising a forest in order to sort of like gather nuts. It sort of like totally destroys the biodiversity of the seabed. The average human now eats more than 20 grams of kilos of fish and seafood every year, more than twice as much as 50 years ago. So the facts are pretty grim. We've got to do something about it. And to do that, we've got to understand many things. And the function of my book is not to sort of give very specific proposals, although various things do come out along the way, but to try and identify the principles that should do that. Now, a couple of the principles, some of the principles are quite general, and a lot of the principles, there are 7 in total. I would say you can identify these principles simply by observing what works and what has worked across the world and throughout history, right? And then you see that time and again, the same kind of things are driving efficient systems. We'll come to those in a way later. There are 2 principles, however, which I think we notice more by their absence. And here is where perhaps the philosophy is more important, but not in the way you might think. So one of the principles I suggest is that we need a principle of, I'm going to call it compassion, because I lack a better word. It's the animals in the food system at the moment are simply, far too many of them are not being treated in a way that I think anyone would consider acceptable, actually. I don't think this is even contentious. So we have a few pictures here, these kind of battery hens. So we've got the A in the corner because we're still on that attending aspect of how to think like a philosopher. Intensive poultry farms, chickens who have the size of an A4 piece of paper to move around on. I've yet to meet anyone who goes, it's fine, they're chickens. Most people are appalled by that, right? Still, chickens are being reared in those kind of conditions. Pigs, and pigs are pretty smart, intelligent animals. You might think that chickens are very, very stupid, and so it doesn't really matter if they can't move. Even if you think that, it's very hard to say the same for pigs. And there are lots of parts of the world in which it's totally legal to keep a sow in a crate where they can't even turn round, right? I don't know how anyone could think that's right. The big picture there is the kind of facility which is springing up all over China. It's a multi-story indoor pig farm. So you have the biggest one created recently was about 15 stories high. So if you can imagine, pigs are basically being reared from birth to slaughter in these multi-story units where they're not even seeing any fresh air, right? Now, I think this has to change. But the point I would say here is that there are lots of, sort of philosophical arguments about animal rights. And we could have many of those arguments here. But actually, I think in a way this is kind of a bit of a red herring. Because I think what you really need to do to get to the most basic point of agreement on animal suffering is simply to pay attention to what animals are and how they're living. I think if you do that and you don't see there's something wrong with it, an argument is not going to persuade you otherwise. Bernard Williams actually had this nice line, I have to paraphrase it, where he lamented this kind of philosopher who believed that, it would have been possible to kind of, argue a Gestapo officer to sort of like change their mind, or whatever it might be, These nice arguments don't work. If you got to the point of being a Gestapo officer, there's something just fundamental you're not noticing or paying attention to in your work. You're basically blind to the humanity of the people that you're slaughtering. Now, I think, and this is quite interesting as well, because I've been lucky enough to interview Peter Singer various times over the years. Peter Singer's a utilitarian, but one thing he agreed with in an interview I had with him once was actually his most basic arguments you don't have to be a utilitarian at all, right, to agree with them. It's basically this. If you pay attention, you will notice a few things. You will notice that quite evidently animals are capable of suffering. They're also capable of pleasure and so forth. That is an evident thing. And that therefore, it would seem just an obvious thing that one should not inflict unnecessary suffering on these animals. This is a very, very basic thing. Now, in a way, I kind of think to require a more complicated argument than that would be kind of strange. Yeah, if you used to see me hitting a small child, let's see, no, not a small child. If you see me like hitting a cat very, very hard, right, and it's screeching out in pain, isn't there something odd in thinking that what I need is a better understanding of philosophy? Surely no. What I need to do is I need to understand that this is a sentient creature and I'm creating unnecessary suffering for no good whatsoever. It's that basic, really. And I think that's true of animals. So, of course, when we get into details of exactly how we ought to treat animals, whether we ought to be vegan or not, for example, well, at that point, we need to have more nuanced arguments, whatever it might be. But for the purposes of this book, I wanted to establish the most basic principles that everyone can agree on. And I think everyone pretty much is going to agree that can't be right to treat animals with such disregard for their welfare that we're causing vast unnecessary suffering to them. We can disagree about whether it's right to keep them at all, and perhaps we'll talk about that in the Q&A. But that basic need for what we call a basic compassion is something that you understand simply by paying attention, I think. It requires no more than that. And what's shocking, I say no more than that, is that very clearly people don't, right? There are in this country still about 4% vegan. You sometimes see inflated figures. The most reliable figures suggest about 4%. The number of vegetarians is possibly an additional similar amount. But of that 96% who are not vegan, what staggers me is how few of them are conscientious in their purchase of animal products, right? So, I'm not a vegan, to put my cards on the table, but I do try to be conscientious about the animal products I get. It seems to me that that's not something that's remotely normal at all. So we choose not to pay attention to this. It's almost like it's a willful kind of blindness. And I think that, that's addressing that is much more important than trying to get people to understand more subtle arguments. A second form of paying attention is around the principle of justice in the food system as well. Now, again, this is very complicated when you're thinking about what the solutions are. But I think, again, there's a division of labor in this, and I think the role a kind of philosopher has in establishing this global food philosophy is to sort of try and get the agreement on the broader set of principles, and we can then have the more detailed arguments later. Justice concerns the fact that built into our food system for a very long time, maybe even for as long as there's been a food system which is more than just people growing food for themselves, has been the exploitation of other human beings in the food system. We saw that, of course, a lot with slavery. And slavery has been part of food production since, the ancient Egyptians and the Romans, right? So there's nothing new in that. But unfortunately, it's simply not true that we've eliminated it. We may have eliminated the old forms of slavery, but we haven't eliminated exploitation. Some of these pictures here, the big picture here is of what is called a chabola. So again, this is Almeria in southern Spain. Who's growing all that lovely, cheap, unseasonal fruit and veg for us? Who's picking it? Well, they're often migrant workers from poor parts of the world, and they're living in these things which are, look, they're just made out of old plastic netting. These are the kind of conditions that they're working in. Now, again, I don't think that maybe someone would argue this, but I think most people would say that, again, I don't need to know if I'm a utilitarian or a Kantian or whatever it might be to understand that this is not what we want to do. I don't think anyone wants to have their food picked by someone who's forced to live in these kind of conditions. I think most of us would think that a just food system would give proper conditions to them. The bottom left picture doesn't sort of show exploitation directly, but this is about tomato harvest in Italy. And again, unfortunately, there's lots of labor abuse in the supply chain for tomatoes in Italy. Organized crime is behind a lot of it. Very interesting article you can still look up. It's published in The Guardian by Tobias Jones investigating this. So again, even our own country, you remember the gangmasters, the Morecambe Bay disaster where the cockle pickers died. That was going on under our noses here. And let alone when you start getting further afield, things like cocoa, cacao, and coffee, where there are huge problems with child labour, whatever it might be. So again, what I'm suggesting here is that if we say there should be more justice in the food system, again, this is not something you need a very nuanced or philosophical argument for. I think that you just simply have to look at what's going on. You just to see the kind of conditions people are working in. You see the disparities in the fact that, a cacao farmer will get paid less in one day than it costs for you to buy one bar of chocolate made with their beans. To see that is an injustice we need to do something about. Like with the compassion, the animal welfare issue, once we're looking into more detailed solutions to that, what exactly we should do to improve it, then there may be a role for more nuanced arguments about what kind of justice we need to see. But we don't need that yet. I'm actually a little aside, I should mention here Amartya Sen. I don't know how many of you have sort of read Amartya Sen. I think he's a really, really interesting thinker. And Amartya Sen sort of gave birth to this form of political philosophy which is called non-ideal political theory. So it's not a very nice, catchy term, is it? But Sen's point was really interesting. He thought the way in which most political philosophy has been done was that people thought their job was to, as it were, come up with an ideal of the way justice should ideally be, and then try and sort of get our existing society to get as close to that as possible. So you start with the ideal conception, that's your model, that gives you the rigor from which you then try and sort of move society towards. Now, he thought that was completely misguided for various reasons. The main one being that actually there will never be a single idea of justice we'd all agree on. That's not just a pessimistic fact about the inability of humans to agree. It's also because justice does have different dimensions and they're not necessarily commensurable. So he gives, in his book, The Idea of Justice, he gives the example of a musical instrument. Which of the three sisters should it go to as a present? The one who made it, but she has a claim of justice, of ownership. The one who has fewest toys, or the one who can play it best, right? There are different ideas of justice, all of which suggest that each of these children is more deserving than the other. And there's no way of simply deciding which one is true. But Sen's point was that we don't need that ideal of justice in order to bring about significant improvement. Rather, and this goes back to the idea of attending, when we look at the way the world is, there are plenty of examples of just self-evident injustice, things which everyone will agree are unfair. We work on removing those. So in a way, you could say that the philosophers talk about what an ideally just food system would be. Well, when we get to the stage where we've removed enough of the evident injustice in the world that we should make that our priority, well, that will be a very happy day indeed. But in the meantime, we should get on with trying to remove the most egregious injustices. We'll worry about what the most perfect system is later. Okay, so there are a couple of things around paying attention, how they apply to the food system. I'll then move on to, just in the sort of second part, things around the idea of making connections. Philosophers should be able to make connections between things, I think. Show the relationship between different ideas, between different concepts. Now, I had a few kind of little sub-rules. In the book, How to Think Like a Philosopher, at the end of each chapter, I had a few summary points to try and capture some of the key ideas. One was to be aware of all kinds of isms and ologies, right? I think that, we learn isms and ologies because they're a nice way of categorizing things. But I think in the real world, the best thinking isn't done by people who are completely wedded to one theoretical sort of framework or theory. I don't think that tends to work very well. Rather, we should let the theory follow the fact, not facts made to fit the theory. When we get too obsessed with whatever our ism might be, I'm a Platonist, I'm a Aristotelian, whatever it might be, the danger is we end up then sort of like making the facts conform to our theories, right? It's the expression "to a hammer everything looks like a nail." We start interpreting the world in a way that makes it most consistent with our theories. It should be the other way around. We should always sort of like start with the way things actually are. If that makes our theories a bit messy, fair enough. Another important, not to mistake an important part of the truth for the whole of it. I think this is what happens as well when people get too wedded to a theory. So I'll give you my kind of theory about theories when it comes to moral theories. Why is it that it seems we have these utilitarian theories, deontological theories, Aristotelian theories? If you're not familiar with these, don't worry. The point I'm making doesn't require you to be. Now, some people think that we need to either find a way of combining all these things, like Derek Parfit tried to do, or we need to pick our theory and see which is the right one. I think the reason why it's never going to work like that is the reason all these three theories have adherents and the reason they're plausible is that they all capture something very, very important about moral reasoning, right? So what's important when you're thinking about any moral issue? Well, you ought to be thinking about the consequences, whether they're good or bad, better or worse, absolutely. And that's what the utilitarian gets right. The problem is, I think, the utilitarian who thinks that's all you have to do is missing an important part of the truth about morality for the whole of it. Because you also have to think about your duties and your responsibilities. Your duties and responsibilities are things which, so whereas thinking about better and worse outcomes are impersonal considerations, you can be entirely objective about them. Your duties and responsibilities arise from the fact that you have a particular place in the world. You have more duties towards your immediate family than you do to strangers. Arguably, you have more responsibilities to your neighbours. You also have responsibilities to employees, co-workers, whatever it might be. So duty is an important part of ethics as well. But again, if you then start thinking, well, it's all about duty, you're again mistaking one important part of ethics for the rest. And the Aristotelian view, flourishing and good character are important of ethics as well. So I think that I lost interest many years ago in trying to decide which moral theory is correct. I think that the way to look at it is they all capture something important about ethics, and we're left with the difficult job of trying to make decisions which balance those things as best as possible. So that's the best way to make connections between things. One thing I think philosophers should try to do is to try and de-dichotomize rigid polarities and not harden them. I think one of the ways in which thinking goes wrong is that people believe there are simple binaries, polarities of thought, and this ends up massively simplifying the world and the contents of their heads. And although philosophers sometimes perhaps are guilty of actually reinforcing that, the good philosophers are trying to overcome that. They're trying to get us to overcome these rigid dichotomies. So what we need to do is to try and join the dots that really are linked and not force false connections. That's the job we do. So how do we do it? So if I go back to that previous point. So these are, I think, 5 kind of like sub-principles I might have about we want to draw connections between things. We want to draw connections in the right way. And the wrong way to draw connections are to try and shoehorn everything into a particular theory, to kind of like see everything only through a part and not the whole, to join the dots in the wrong ways and to have these rigid polarities. That's what I think what it means like to think like a philosopher. Now, if you think in this way, and then you look at the food world, I think that one conclusion you're drawn to is a principle which I call pluralism. I think that what you kind of recognize is that there is no simple one-size-fits-all for prescription for any aspect of the food world. There isn't one system of agriculture which works everywhere. There isn't one diet which everyone should follow. There isn't necessarily even one kind of economic model which best or shows how we should do the work. And there isn't one kind of like, if you think about the role of technology, there isn't a simple answer which is use it all or not. So the example I'd give is around food production. I think a lot of people think that you've got a fundamental choice to make between extractive, exploitative, polluting, industrial agriculture, as they call it, and something like organic farming. In fact, even on the organic side, what people think of the organic side, there are many different shades of grey. We have the Soil Association Organic Standard. We also have a standard called Pasture for Life for meat and dairy. And that has a different set of priorities, because whereas organic standards are very much about controlling the kind of inputs you put into your farming, Pasture for Life is more concerned with the idea of whether or not cattle are being raised essentially on grass or indoors and other feeds. They both have their desiderata. But I think the key issue here is that the whole, again, we can talk about this later if you like, I have to more or less assert it rather than argue for it. But the very idea that there is this sort of neat distinction between, organic, agroecological, regenerative farming on the one side and industrial farming on the other is a huge simplification of what actually goes on. I mean, first of all, if you look in certain countries like America, there is what some people call big organic. There are very, very large farms being run, get organic certification, that are pretty much indistinguishable from some non-organic farms. But there's also lots of ways of farming in ways which are sensitive to the environment, which do not require organic certification. Organic standards are very, very specific, and they've got a rather idiosyncratic history. But the middle mark there I've got is LEAF. It's called Linking Environment and Farming. It's a scheme which encourages, again, farmers to do good practice around, biodiversity on their lands, etc., etc. It's absolutely not organic, and there are farms that farm in this way which, look from the outside perhaps like industrial farms. If you want to see an example of one, look up the episode of Wild Isle, the BBC series about about Britain's wildlife. There was a program which is available on the iPlayer. It wasn't actually broadcast on television, which was about the environment, and it features the Barker brothers who have a farm in Norfolk. And the first thing they say on the program is, we're a proud, big proper industrial farm, right? So they grow crops, they go into the mainstream food system, they do it at scale, they do it efficiently. But actually, they've got the facts to show. They farm in ways which are very, very good for biodiversity. They catalogue all the different kinds of moth, beetle, birds seen on their farm. They do very, very well indeed. And people like this, they challenge sort of any sort of simplistic ideal we might have. There's a one-size-fits-all model for how we should grow food. And I think the same goes for other aspects of the food system as well. So I think that, when you're trying to look at the big picture of the food system, I think that, and you sort of think about it in a philosophical way, I think you are inevitably drawn to accept some kind of pluralism, because anything which tries to sort of like impose a one-size-fits-all solution is letting a kind of an ideology or a theory to drive ahead of what the facts are, whatever they might be. Another principle, so in principle of connection, a sub-principle I mentioned is you don't just analyze things in terms of their parts. You have to look for holistic explanations of how the whole works. I think this is interesting because I think that in sort of post-Enlightenment Western thinking, there has been quite a lot of emphasis on reductionism, because reductionist thinking has actually been quite successful in lots of ways. It did sort of give science a real old boost. But I think that we've got to the point where it's not anti-science, in fact it's pro-science to accept the fact that the best science these days is accepting the fact you have to go beyond looking at this sort of like highly reductive view and look at the way systems work as a whole. And a lot of the most interesting science is done around system thinking. When you do that, when you try and see things more holistically, I think you're drawn to a principle of circularity. So circularity is something which all successful food systems in history have had. If you go back to the hunter-gatherers, it's entirely circular. By circular, we mean it doesn't require the constant addition of external inputs. It's kind of self-sustaining. So hunter-gatherers, of course, were a beautifully circular system because they would get up and move according to the systems. They would go somewhere, they would take food, they would hunt animals, but they would always only take as much as could be fully replenished by the next year. Not because they were environmentalists, it's because they had evolved this way of working, right? They wouldn't have been able to survive if they were depleting it. So it worked brilliantly. Unfortunately, however, hunter-gathering takes a lot of time, and maybe not as much time as, you might think, less time than a full-time job, but you probably have to spend about 20, 25 hours a week doing it, and that's the whole society. And also the amount of land you need to sustain hunter-gatherers is a level of density. I think we'd have, actually there's a typo in the first edition of the book. I said we'd have to get rid of 96% of Britain's population in order to sustain hunter-gathering. In fact, it's 99. So we'd have to all be dead. But you see circularity in other systems as well. So one picture here is of the Pampas in Argentina. Actually, you can't see any cattle there. And that's probably a typical picture. The grazing in the Pampas is so extensive that actually it'd be very typical for you not to see any cattle at all. They'd be somewhere else. They'd be in the next valley. For a start, there's also the winter-summer thing. In the summer they go to the higher ground, in the winter the lower ground. The cattle grazing on the Pampas is highly sustainable. So although, red meat gets a very bad press, and that's because the way most of it is produced today is highly unsustainable. The cows are kept indoors in feedlots. Rainforests are raised to the ground to grow soybeans to feed them. That's not a remotely circular system. But the traditional grazing systems are entirely circular. They don't need, I spoke to a farmer who's got cattle in a Pampas. They don't have to buy any feed at all. Of course they don't. There's plenty of grass there. And actually the grazing animals actually help to maintain the land as well. There's lots of evidence that if you have the right level of grazing, it helps to maintain the fertility of the land rather than degrades it. And the other picture there is, I mentioned fish farming earlier. There's forms of fish farming which are wonderfully sustainable. The oldest form of fish farming is more than 2 millennia old. It goes back to China. And it's the rice fish system. So the carp, a little trivia pursuits question for you. Carp is the world's most farmed fish. It's not salmon, as a lot of people think it might be. That's because carp is still one of the most popular farmed fish all over Asia. The fish are in the paddy fields with the rice, and it creates this symbiotic system. If you've got like the vegetation, the fish poo, the fish breathing, etc., manages to keep clean but nutrient-rich waters which are suitable both for the fish and for the rice. So we have plenty of examples of circularity, and the problem is with our current food system is that it isn't. It's dependent on a constant supply of external inputs. Predominantly synthetic fertilizers, and these just sort of like keep depleting resources in the bigger system, and that's why it won't work. So we need to have a circular food system. The other thing is we need to think holistically more generally, and so again, if we think holistically, let's take this question of yields, right? This is where things get complicated. If you take a modern industrial farm, of which the one to your left is perhaps an example of, huge monocultures, you look at the yield per acre of land, it may look very, very impressive. But of course, you need to look at the whole system, because that productivity is dependent upon the fact that external resources are coming in, which have their own climate footprints, energy footprints, costs, etc., etc. So the apparent efficiency of the farm is often being sort of like exaggerated by the fact we're not looking for all the external inputs which are required. At the same time, a little smallholder farm may look very attractive and very romantic in lots of ways too, but when you look holistically, they're not always as good as they might seem either. The most robust evidence does repeatedly suggest that organic farms are about 80% less productive than non-organic farms. That is even allowing for, the external inputs, the fact that the organic farmers have fewer of them. So when we're looking at any kind of food system, you have to take that holistic view. You have to kind of really take into account everything. And that's where hopefully the philosophical skills of trying to be rigorous in our thinking might help. I think holism is particularly important when we think about nutrition. This could be a subject of a whole talk by itself. We're all very aware now of, I say aware, it remains somewhat contested. There are diets which are made up predominantly of whole, proper foods like you see in the market, and there are diets which are made up of things which have been processed and packaged, mainly sort of ultra-processed foods. And, a lot of people think that we're far too dependent on the ultra-processed foods. Now, this is a big, complex debate. I think the summary answer is yes, there's a lot of simplification about and certain vaguenesses and ambiguities about ultra-processed means, but I think in a way, people can make too much of that. It is true we have too much of those wrong foods. But one thing I came to the conclusion of in the book is that one of the reasons we've been led this way is that we have been seduced by this idea of what an academic called Georgi Skinis calls nutritionism. The idea that we judge the healthiness of a diet by basically looking at its nutrient contents. This is a particular label you get on a food, right? Oh, I didn't mean that. I meant a little button, but I haven't got one. See that one? Oh, there we go, right. Yeah, so this kind of label, okay? So, you list the fat, the saturated fat, the cholesterol, the carbohydrates, the protein, the sodium, the vitamins, etc. The idea is that this kind of information will tell you how nutritious a particular food is, right? Now, the fact is that it's very interesting that this kind of system has been fully embraced by manufacturers. This is actually for a label of crunchy nut cornflakes in India, I believe. There's an argument this is completely misguided. This is the big mistake we made. It turns out that there's lots of evidence now that in order to determine what a healthy food is, you can't just list the nutrients. It matters the form in which those nutrients come to us, because the way in which the body processes them will change depending on that form. So the hypothesis is that in highly processed foods, yes, it may have these vitamins and stuff fortified in it, but you don't absorb those vitamins in the same way as you do when they come in whole foods. This, as a broad principle, this is not contentious, by the way. There may be some people in this room, well, there will be people in this room who will be advised to be careful of their calcium content, because we all of us get thinning bones as we get older, and for women particularly do. So they're very much advised to get plenty of calcium. But as you probably know, the problem is that you can take a calcium tablet, but you don't absorb the calcium in the tablet as efficiently as you do when you get calcium from things like whole milk. Whole fat milk, by the way, because you don't absorb it in the same way from skim milk as from whole fat milk, etc., etc. So these things are not contentious. But the point is that there's so much we don't understand about the various interrelations, how certain combinations of food affect us. And actually what it turns out is so in the meantime, without having sort of a final answer, the most sensible thing we can do for ourselves is to think that, do you know what, the most healthy diet is one which I say simply food-centric. It's not nutrient-centric. It's not about obsessing about the exact contents of omega-3, omega-6, whatever it might be, vitamin B12. A diet which is made up of primarily whole foods is going to give you the better kind of balance than one which is made up of highly processed foods and supplements. It's as simple as that. There is a philosophical root to that, but I'm going on too long anyway, so I better wrap up, right? Let's have a conclusion. Those are the 7 principles I've got. I've mentioned a few of them: pluralism, holism, circularity, compassion, and justice and food centrism. I mentioned all of those. I haven't mentioned resourcefulness, but we have to save something for another day. There we go. So anyway, I've given you quite too brief a tour maybe, but what I've tried to give is a bit of a sense of the kind of ideas that I present in the book, but give you a bit of a sense about why philosophy is actually important to this. It's not important to this because I've applied heavy-duty major theories. And that's partly because I don't think that's the way philosophy is useful. It's been there because I think the ways in which philosophy teaches you how to think enable us to think about anything that we're thinking about with a certain level of generality, right? It enables us to make those connections, make the right connections, not the wrong connections, to sort of like take things as they actually are, rather than to impose our prior views on them. So I think what the book, I hope, exemplifies is how a philosophical way of thinking can give you some way of getting a handle on something as complex and as difficult as the food system, but it can point you to fairly specific principles, which I think we can then use to do that. This is the conclusion of the book. Too many calls for change are utopian, requiring a wholesale shift of values that is not going to happen. But fortunately, we do not need to tear the whole system down and start again. Positive change depends only on people recognizing that the values we already hold are discordant with the food system that we have, and the values and practices can be brought into harmony by a series of adjustments, some radical, all ad hoc and doable. So the will for change and the possibility for change can converge, join forces, and transform how the world eats for the better. And at that point, I shall stop and take your questions, objections, hopefully no pieces of rotten fruit being thrown. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian, for a very entertaining and very poignant deep dive into the food industry. It's amazing the kind of breadth and depth you've covered in the last 45 to 55 minutes. So I'm sure there will be lots of questions. So we'll start in the room as always, and then we go online. Online, by the way, I haven't seen any questions on the computer, so feel free to put your questions to Julian there. But there's a gentleman in the room. If you could speak directly into it head on, because it's not multi-directional.
Julian, thanks very much for the talk. Just in terms of the water rights issue in southern Spain, did you come across the work of Eleanor Ostrom? Because she studied that quite extensively.
Oh, sorry. Probably not. Sorry, I've now got me here, which is a little bit pain, but that's all right. Maybe we can sort that out in a minute. No, I haven't. Sorry, but you know, yes. Actually, to be honest, because it was a fairly, I mentioned it here as a very striking thing. But it's not something going into detail, but yeah. So you can tell us more about this.
Well, just very briefly. I mean, she won a Nobel Prize in economics, and she was very interested in what she called polysystems, basically. That there wasn't necessarily one right answer. So that might have quite an interesting overlap with some of the things that you were saying. But one that the things that she found in terms of food production, and she looked specifically at the water rights in southern Spain, and she identified it was very much of an issue of the tragedy of the commons, which I'm sure you'll have come across the idea there, and that it was largely fixed by property rights, even if those property rights were held within communities, cooperatives, or things like that. And she also looked at overfishing in several lakes in Africa, and came to a very similar conclusion, that you had to really reduce the idea of a tragedy of the commons, because things would get overfished. And I think this was taken up by the New Zealand government about, not the most recent one, about 10, 15 years ago, and they sorted out all their fishing rights and whatever, and then they sorted them out into property rights, and now they don't overfish. And it's this simple thing: if you just put the resource there and say it's a free-for-all and everybody can go for it, you will get this classic tragedy of the commons situation. But if you can divide it into property rights, people preserve it because they have their interests are aligned, basically, to do so.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I think, although I think it probably has to be not quite as simple as that in the sense, because I think that, property rights arguably also can be part of the problem, in the sense that property rights also, I think there are property responsibilities. So I think you're right. Sometimes it just becomes naked self-interest. If you've got rights over something, then you're not going to deplete it, and I think that will do a lot. At the same time, I think on land in particular, the problem there is that if people have got property rights, but then other parts of the system are incentivizing them to farm that land in unsustainable ways, that isn't going to work. And that's what a lot of people say about the way that the post-war food system was. So what happened in Europe a lot was, of course, the Second World War was a real shock. There were some parts of, Britain was worried it wouldn't be able to feed itself. We got through, we needed rationing. there are countries like the Netherlands. The Netherlands features quite a lot in my book because they went through a terrible time. They had this Dutch hunger winter, which was partly a result of the Germans actually sort of like stopping them, and people died. So there's that feeling like we're never going to have too little food again. So they put huge resources into making farmland more productive, and that did involve, of course, on land, absolute property rights. Consolidation of farms into larger farms is one of the big things that happened. But the point is, at the same time, you then had farmers who had an interest in getting the maximum out of their land, but the incentives they were given were encouraging them to not farm that land in ways which were long-term sustainable. They became heavily dependent upon the fertilizers, over-tilling, whatever it might be. So I think, yes, so I'm taking a broad point. Perhaps for the seas and waters, it's more straightforward, but people also have to have the sort of regulatory incentives. And I think that's the other thing as well, because when people, there are some people think there should be simple free market solutions, et cetera, et cetera. And what they don't recognize is there isn't a country in the world where there isn't a lot of regulation, there isn't a lot of subsidy, et cetera, et cetera. So there isn't a kind of perfectly free market anywhere. So the problem is we've got to make sure the incentives we give people are the right incentives, not the wrong ones, I think. Anyway, so I'm agreeing with your broad point, but giving a little supplementary qualifier. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got Robert online. He asked the question, food has a powerful symbolic and emotional quality for human beings. Food as status, food as a focus for group binding, etc. How do you see these impacting on the nutrisphere?
Yeah, okay, it's a good question. Again, I have a chapter in the book where I talk about the importance of food for culture, and it is extremely important. So I have to say that one thing I deliberately didn't do for this book was to travel a lot, because I think partly there's a kind of a way of doing nonfiction these days, which is all about the journey of the author, and they tell you about how they came off the plane and all that kind of stuff. And some people do it very well, but I think it's become a cliche. But I also think it's in this subject, it trivializes it. It really isn't about me. I didn't want it to be about me. In fact, I didn't use the first person pronoun. Apart from the introduction and conclusion, I kept myself out of it, except I had to make it clear I was interviewing someone. So it's really not about me. But so I went to places, not by going to them, but by speaking to people who knew more than I did. And one of the places I went to, in inverted commas, was the refugee camps, the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. Loads of people have written very interestingly about that. And you might think if there's anywhere in the world where food would be about, fuel and survival, it would be in these refugee camps. But it's the exact opposite. Even perhaps especially in these dire situations, the symbolic and cultural importance of food is really important. So you had this story of a daughter and a mother who were making their masala spice mix, right? Now, if you think about it, spices are very interesting. They don't really give you any sort of calorific boost. They don't give you much, if any, nutritional boost. But in these extreme conditions, they prioritized trying to grow these little spices in the little bit of land they had outside their hut and making these spices, because it was so important to them to maintain that tradition, that continuity, that memory of the home they longed to go back for. And the most important times of the day in the camps were often the evening meals where people would share and so forth. So I think, culture is very, very important to food. And, when we talk about the food system, we should never sort of imagine we're talking about simply, nutrients and calories as though it was a pure fuel thing. But culture's also got a quite important role, has had an important role in actually sustaining healthy practices. What you find time and again is there's this thing that the anthropologists call the nutrition transition. Whenever you find a traditional society, a traditional diet, and people are moving towards a more Western diet, as they call it, the health outcomes always go down. It's like an almost universal law, right? Now, in the long run, they may bounce back and they may be okay, but certainly in the short to medium term, health outcomes go down. And it kind of is kind of evidence of the fact that traditional diets, they evolve. They're not something that's been designed by a committee. They've evolved over time, and the reason that they've survived is because they fulfill needs. So there's a kind of the culture has a kind of collective wisdom. And I think sometimes the problem is that if we don't have the scientific understanding of why it's a good system, and all we have is a kind of a folk interpretation, which is nonsense because it doesn't really make sense, then it's easy to dismiss it. So let's say, for example, you want to understand about the Inuit diet, and you haven't done any scientific studies about it, and it doesn't seem to make sense because it's mainly fat and blubber and things like this. And you ask the Inuit about it, and they say, "Oh, well, the mingling of the seal blood and the human blood gives us strength and energy." The temptation is for the scientific person to go, "Well, that's a lot of nonsense. I'm going to forget all about that." But actually, the fact that they don't have a way of conceptualizing it, which stacks up scientifically, is kind of not important, because the chances are the dietary pattern they've kept does do something good, and in time we would find out what that is if we could study it scientifically. But you could have a kind of presumption that until proven guilty, a traditional diet has probably got some sort of wisdom built into it, even if it can't be articulated. In terms of the Inuit, it's quite extraordinary because they get vitamins and things which you'd think they couldn't possibly get because we typically get them from plants. But they come from the small amount of plant matter that they do eat, but also because they traditionally ate every part of the animal, things like vitamin C, etc., will be found in the innards of the animals, in things like the inner organs and so forth. So there's a lot of like cultural knowledge around nutrition in this as well, which we ought to sort of recognize is probably there, even if we can't account for it.
Okay, thank you. There's two more questions in the room. We'll start off with the lady and then go to the gentleman.
Firstly, thank you for a fascinating talk. I wanted to make two observations really on it. Firstly, I absolutely think principles is the most settling on principles is the right way to go. And there's none of your principles which I would seriously disagree with. However, I still think there are some I think have missed out. And I was particularly, when you started talking about yields and comparing organic and non-organic, and I thought, hang on, but yields are, the underlying principle there is efficiency. And efficiency needs to be balanced with resilience. So if you started comparing those two situations, from a resilience perspective, you might well find that the organic one is going to win hands down. And food resilience is really important, as we discovered when we have wars and supply chains get disrupted. So that's my first point. The second observation I wanted to make is, if you're really pluralist, why are you only looking at the food system? Because the food system is food is an issue which covers culture, as we've just talked about. It's the economic system which you're working in has a big impact on it. It impacts on health and well-being. You can go on for ages. So I think we need to be aware that the food system is interacting and connected to lots of other systems. But
on the second point, I mean, I do. I only had 45 minutes. There's a whole chapter on big business and food. So it's a lot about the economic systems in which people work. There's a thing about governance, which is about sort of regulation. There's about the use of technology. And there's quite a bit about waste and how that kind of works. So I mean, when I say food system, I actually talk about the food world, which includes not just the food system, but all those other aspects are in there. So absolutely. In terms of the pluralism, you say, why don't I also, you talk about the yields, etc. Well, again, actually, I think, again, this is just, it's an artifact of the brevity, but what you're saying is, I think, explicitly covered in the book. You say I'm implicitly endorsing efficiency, but we also talk of resilience. I think what we might want to say is, what I say time and again is we need to look holistically. And you look at it holistically, on narrow definitions of efficiency aren't enough, right? So now I would argue actually that it's a bad understanding of efficiency if you don't take into account all the effects, etc., including resilience, right? So you could say that efficiency is a wrong value, or you might say that it's the wrong version of efficiency. But all I can say is absolutely what you're saying is in the book explicitly and clearly. If you're comparing organic farms to other kind of farms, you have to look holistically, you have to look at long term as well as the short term, etc., etc. Unfortunately, I still think personally my own conclusion is, and here's the tricky thing, right? It is true, I think, that the worst and most destructive and most unsustainable forms of agricultural production have been what we would call industrial forms, right? That is true. But the problem is it's a really, really broad term. So what people don't, I think, recognize is that we absolutely should be getting rid of those worst exploitative, extractive, polluting forms of industrial agriculture. But that doesn't mean what we're left with is only those farms we would now call organic, regenerative, whatever it might be. Those leaf farms that I talked about, which you can sort of see exemplified on wild isles, are examples of farms which are sustainable, etc., etc. So I totally agree with the basic contentions you put forward. I don't know whether your conclusion is that if you did that, you would find that organic farmers always win hands down. My view is, and check it out, because everything's based on expert testimony, etc., is that there's lots of farms which wouldn't tick the boxes of organic, etc., which can also be very, very sustainable, resilient, good for wildlife, etc. And just final point is, I think you can't afford to completely neglect the issue of efficiency, because if it takes twice as much land to produce the same amount of food, that has impacts on biodiversity, etc. So obviously, and there's a huge debate here about, if you farm the land well, you will be able to have biodiversity on the farmland. That is true, but you'll never have as much biodiversity on a farmland as you would on a land which isn't being used for farming at all, or building, whatever it might be. So there's a kind of balance. So efficiency actually has to be part of it if you're being realistic, but not a narrow understanding of efficiency which doesn't take into account resilience in the long term. I totally agree.
Thank you, Julian. Based on the first two questions in the room, we only have room for one more question. So if you could keep your questions and observations slightly shorter to one sentence, then we might get a few more questions in before 9 o'clock. Now, there was a gentleman here. Do you still want to ask a question?
I'll try and say it quickly. Thanks, Julian, for those different perspectives. You started with some facts, and I just wanted to add a couple that I thought might open some new lines of inquiry. If we look at the planet Earth and ignore the mountains and the ice caps, half of the habitable land on Earth is used for farming. And that's a considerable amount of wealth that's locked up in that land, equal to all the real estate on the planet. But the really interesting thing is how that land is used, that farmland. 80% of it is used for meat production and dairy, but that only produces 20% of the calories. And the flip side of that is 10% of all the land on Earth is used to produce 80% of calories. So that does, you raised the question around bricks eating more meat and about the efficiency of the land, but actually that raises some fundamental questions about how we use meat today and also how much we waste, because we waste half of the food that we produce. So I think there's just some interesting perspectives there that may draw slightly different conclusions.
Yeah. I don't think they draw. I don't think they draw different conclusions, because those are things that are all discussed in the book. So when it comes to the amount of land that is being used to essentially raise livestock, it is ridiculously high. It isn't sustainable, right? Okay. Now again, this is something which I think this is unfortunate. Actually, I wrote a piece for who was it? Prospect or Guardian recently, which you might want to look up on this. What's interesting is that it's quite remarkable actually what pretty much all informed observers agree on. all informed observers agree that there needs to be a very, very large reduction in meat and dairy consumption in industrialized nations, right? The problem, I think, with that is that the way that's landed with the public is that they think that means that people are telling them they ought to give up meat and dairy altogether. And they think it's in, so they slip into this sort of binary thing. They think it's an argument for veganism versus the right to eat meat and dairy. Now, of course, there are people who think we should go entirely vegan, but again, the arguments for reduced meat and dairy consumption are not arguments for veganism. To give a concrete example, the Eat Lancet report, you may well have heard of, a major commission of people from various different disciplines charged with coming up with a diet which was both healthy and could sort of be contained within our planetary boundaries. And they reported various things. One thing, actually, interestingly enough, it was a pluralistic report. It acknowledged the fact that different parts of the world, there are different cultures, also different kind of types of land, and therefore they gave ranges for the kind of food that people should eat, accepting the fact that if you're from Ireland, for example, where you've got quite a lot of grassland and all that kind of stuff, you may be able to eat more beef than you could in like Saudi Arabia, right? So everyone agrees we ought to eat considerably less. But what's interesting, of course, is that even that report, I looked at what it recommended you could eat, and I found that as the kind of omnivore that I have, I was okay with that. I'm fine, you know. It's staggering how much meat and dairy people, the average person, still eats. You don't need to eat that much. You don't need to give it up. Because the other thing about the land is that when it comes to this argument, people kind of focus on the fact that, yes, the vast majority of meat and dairy that's produced these days is produced in ways which are extremely inefficient for the reasons you've suggested, that land is being turned over to grow feed to the animals, and this is not giving a lot of calories, etc., etc. But if we ate the appropriate types and quantities of meat and dairy, that wouldn't be the case at all. So, for example, I mean, take the obvious example is that cattle in the pampas, but not in the pampas, pasture-reared cattle is basically on land which isn't suitable for arable farming, right? Pigs, lots of animals are eating things which are inedible to human beings. Food waste, for example. Pigs used to be fed on a lot of food waste, and that was stopped after mad cow, but it can be done safely. So actually, there is a way. The way in which we used to produce meat didn't require giving up all this land to grow feed to them, and it was sustainable. So we need a very, very large reduction, but not to zero for it to be sustainable. And I think it's a real shame that, as I say, I think the problem is that message hasn't really got through. People think it's like, you know, veganism versus burgers as usual, and that really isn't the case. Have I addressed, was there something missing from that? I think that there's a... Yeah. Well, again, this goes back to, I mean, I try to steer clear of highly specific prescriptions and try and stick to the general principles, I have to say. But I think there are huge issues around that. I have to say, this is a point, I don't argue this in the book, but just as a little thought, sometimes I think to myself, you know, sometimes we end up with a system that everyone takes for granted, and then in hindsight you think this is really crazy. I kind of think it should be illegal to own land of any kind. I mean, seriously, it might sound radical. You need some way of giving people the rights over a land for their lifetime and maybe a little bit longer, because that people will then look after it, they have an interest in it, etc., etc. But there should be no ownership of land in perpetuity, right? I mean, that makes no sense at all. I mean, the land is our shared earth. So I think actually one of the things we need is a way of totally kind of rethinking how it is we grant people exclusive rights over land. And the old idea is simply, you got the deeds, you own it, it's yours forever. It's kind of crazy.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I would like to do one final poll just to test Julian's numbers. How many of you are vegetarians in the room?
It's probably higher than the national average.
And how many of you are vegan?
2.
Good.
Slightly lower. No, it's about the national average, actually. Yeah.
Okay. So Bath is representative of your 4 and 4%. Okay, well, we've come to the end, and obviously please, please, please reflect on all the things that Julian has put into his book, because it is something quite unique to put the food industry into so much context of the overall biosphere of the planet that we inhabit. So I think some really good thoughts for thought, and please put your hands together to show your appreciation for Julian.